So in 1893, a young Gandhi arrived in South Africa as this, young, sort of optimistic lawyer, uncertain and sort of struggling professionally at times. And this train journey from Durban to Pretoria was interrupted at Pietermaritzburg. And this was where he was thrown off for refusing to move from first class to third class, despite holding a valid ticket. This became sort of an origin story of sorts. But the story behind this moment is a lot more complex than the story itself can suggest. So let's explain. In the early years, Gandhi had some racial biases that were explicit and documented. He argued that Indians deserve better treatment than Africans because, they had a civility to them. And he sometimes used derogatory terms for black Africans in his writings and his speeches early on. And this wasn't merely, a strategic position to get like white sympathy or try to like associate with the people that were controlling India at the time, though that was certainly, a part of it. Gandhi kind of believed in this sort of racial caste idea, placing Indians above Africans but below whites. And he sort of had this racialized philosophy early on. And his early activism wasn't about equality for all necessarily, but about securing sort of a middle position for Indians in South Africa's racial order. And what made Gandhi's story remarkable is not that he was free of prejudice, right? Like he wasn't necessarily a perfect person early on, but that he slowly moved beyond these biases shaped by, the time that he lived in and the place that he grew up. And I think it's just an important note that, people throughout all history at certain times of their life can believe awful, terrible things that are, demeaning to what it actually means to be, a citizen on earth and being like a good human being. But that doesn't mean that that defines you forever and that you can change. You can actually make a step to be a better person, a more inclusive person, a more open-minded person, see people for who they are rather than, the nation they're from or the color of their skin. And this change for Gandhi took many years and, in some ways was never fully complete, but it was real, right? It was an actual progress in his life. And his views began to shift through experiences like, meeting African leaders such as John Dube and recognizing the shared struggle of all oppressed people around the world. And while his attitude towards, Africans really improved throughout his life, there were still some, patronizing views, which African thinkers like, Pixley Kassem criticized, even while, working alongside him. And this growth, I think, again, shows something really important about his character. He's open to becoming a better person, to learning, and willing to change his views throughout, having experiences with people. And it was this ability to grow, not with, perfection, but it was this idea that helped him, become a powerful leader and a moral example. So during his 21 years in South Africa, Gandhi developed the techniques that would define his approach and influence, his philosophy and his movement worldwide. The idea around this movement or this philosophy known as satyagraha and or this the truth force as it would be translated into English was built around non-violent resistance and moral pressure. But even satyagraha sprang from some type of contradiction, right? Gandhi felt both the duty to serve in imperial wars and, deep discomfort with the violence that came from them. He organized ambulance corps during the Boer Wars and the Zulu Rebellion, arguing that Indians needed to prove their loyalty through service, yet he was kind of troubled by the violence that he witnessed. And I think that's a interesting thing for just people to ponder, right? Like if you live in America, for example, on the one hand, you're like, this is a country of, laws and rules and, it's a place where everyone can be equal and become the best version of themselves. But at the same time, there's some bad stuff and there's a history of racism or, economic, oppression or anything like that. Or, I like where America's at in the world and we're the leader and, global freedoms. But at the same time, we do some wars and some stuff overseas that's, not ideal, but I benefit from it. Is that good? I think at times we all deal with these contradictions, even today. And Gandhi was no different. And the development of this idea, the satyagraha, at the Phoenix settlement and later at Tolstoy Farm, represented his attempt to resolve these contradictions through community experiments. And these effectively, are ashrams, and they became laboratories for his, ideas about simple living, manual labor, spiritual discipline. They were these ambitious experiments, like a real effort to build small-scale models of the just society that he believed could happen on Earth, where people of all different backgrounds and religions and nations could live together in equal and mutual respect. And these communities also revealed Gandhi's control and his desire to sort of, architect ideas and sometimes his struggles with relationships, particularly his complex dynamic with his wife, Kasturba. But they demonstrated something more important, his commitment to testing his ideas in practice rather than simply just preaching them. And this willingness to experiment, to fail, and to try again would become central to his method and kind of his credibility as a leader. So, Gandhi's philosophical development during his South African years represented a remarkable kind of synthesis of Eastern and Western thought that drew in people from all over. He tapped into the Bhagavad Gita and this concept of selfless action, the Jain principle of ahimsa or nonviolence, and the Christian ideal of turning the other cheek. But he also absorbed Thoreau's idea of civil disobedience, or Tolstoy's Christian anarchism, or Ruskin's technique of industrial society. He was taking all of these different ideas and philosophies and sort of fusing them, using his law work, but also his religious work growing up. And this fusion is not just intellectual, it's also personal and lived and tested every single day. So Gandhi took the abstract concept of truth, or satya, and made it the foundation of political action. Gandhi saw truth and nonviolence not merely as these ideals that are noble, but as like tools. These are like precise instruments for social transformation. And by refusing to participate in systems that he considered unjust, by willingly accepting suffering rather than inflicting or causing on people, he could expose the sort of ethical or moral contradictions of his opponents and appeal to, their better nature, by coming at it in really good faith and openness. And the genius of Satyagraha lay in its recognition that if you want change to last for a long time, it requires not just defeating your opponents, but converting them to actually change their hearts, not just to, stop their thought. And this wasn't naive idealism. Gandhi knew that conversion often required pressure and sometimes confrontation in some ways, just never hatred. But his method offered a way to fight injustice without being consumed by that hatred, to resist oppression without just creating more cycles of violence that perpetuate and beget each other. So when Gandhi returned to India in 1915, he was still largely unknown beyond sort of like the kind of academic or intellectual political circles of the time. And his transformation into Mahatma, the great soul, translated, was gradual and not without some resistance. Even Gandhi himself was kind of uneasy with the title, often expressing like a discomfort with the reverence it commanded and sometimes the expectation that it carried. He preferred to be seen not as like a spiritual authority, but as a seeker in the path for truth. Someone that's just along the journey with everyone else, all of his followers and acolytes. And his early years in India were marked by these careful observations and like this patience. His political mentor had advised him to spend a year watching and learning, just to kind of absorb what's happening in the society. What is the feeling of the people? But Gandhi's innate urgency to do something pulled him towards local struggles where he felt people needed support. So he began involving himself in some local disputes. In Champaran with indigo farmers, in Kedah with cotton farmers, in Ahmedabad with textile workers. He was just putting himself into these local issues. And these campaigns revealed both Gandhi's extraordinary strength and his occasional limitations. He had this almost uncanny ability to connect with just regular common people, making these complex political ideas and sort of philosophies about how government should run, democracy, accessible through symbols and stories. And his decision to wear only India and Indian-made cloth, to spin his own thread, to live a simple life. These weren't just gestures, but like real, genuine attempts to bridge the gap between political leaders and the masses that, they claim that they're representing. So Gandhi's daily routines became kind of legendary, but they were more than just these personal quirks. They were integral to the philosophy and his effectiveness as a leader. He did these things every single day. He would rise before dawn for prayer, meditation, and he spent long hours, spinning cotton and maintaining these extensive correspondences with supporters and also skeptics, and followed strict dietary practices. And, he continually adjusted through self-experimentation just throughout his life. And this discipline served a bunch of different purposes, and I think there's a lot that everyone can take away from this. It demonstrated that he lived by the principles that he preached, which obviously gives a ton of authenticity to the message. And through spinning, Gandhi forged a link with India's rural masses.